During the Hundred Years' War, when the French suffered one defeat after another at the hands of the inexorable British, and the collapse of France itself was a foregone conclusion, a simple village girl appeared on the stage of world history who is known to us as Joan of Arc or the Maid of Orlean. At the age of 17, she led the French people and became their liberator, placing the fugitive French king on the throne, which was taken away by the British. This girl, having neither military experience nor elite troops who followed other commanders, managed to inspire ordinary soldiers to great feats by the power of her character. The course of the war was largely turned around by her efforts. However, the fate of Joan of Arc was tragic. In one of the battles, she was captured by the British, where she was subjected to severe torture and was burned alive at the stake of the Inquisition on charges of heresy. According to witnesses, Joan was the purest and brightest creature of those dark ages. Therefore, her sacrificial death became a symbol that flared up in the eyes of the entire French people and determined their self-awareness for thousands of years to come. In this issue, we learn the story of the life and death of the Maid of Orlean, Joan of Arc. In the 14th century, one of the largest wars of the Middle Ages broke out. The English King Edward III decided to take power over all of France into his own hands, thereby creating a single and most powerful kingdom in all of Europe. This event became known as the Hundred Years' War. For 80 years, neither side could gain the upper hand in this confrontation. Both peoples were exhausted by protracted hostilities, and the border lands turned into scorched wasteland and ruins. But everything changed in 1413, when a new king, Henry V, who was distinguished by strategic talent and unprincipled cruelty, came to power in England. In a short time, he put an end to all internal strife, which was taking away significant British forces, and organized a full-scale invasion of the mainland. At the same time, he made significant changes in military tactics, giving preference to longbows in the face of French knights. Already in the first battles, this brought such colossal success that the British moved deep into enemy territory without much difficulty. It got to the point that in the Battle of Agincourt, 6,000 British, mostly archers, under the command of King Henry, defeated a 36,000 army of French knights, effectively beheading the French army. For this battle, Henry V received the nickname the Butcher of Agincourt. The King of France at that time was Charles VI, nicknamed the Mad. Due to his illness, he found himself helpless in the face of the new threat from the north. He ignored the experience of Agincourt and completely withdrew from commanding the troops. The feudal lords were forced to organize resistance on their own, without a single leader, and lost battles over and over again. Ultimately, only one name remained from France. Half of the French lands were already in the hands of the British, and further defeat was only a matter of time. Against this background, power in the country was taken into the hands of the wife of the Mad King, Isabella of Bavaria, who entered into negotiations with Henry V and promised him the hand of her daughter, Catherine. Thus, Henry's heir received two crowns, English and French. Charles the Mad's condition was so grave that Henry even agreed to wait for his death, recognizing his nominal right to be called a French monarch. However, even after the death of Charles the Mad, some French feudal lords continued to show stubborn resistance to the British, the symbol of which was the large city of Orleans. Henry believed that the fall of Orleans would put an end to this conflict, and the British troops began to besiege it. It was during such a difficult time for France that Joan of Arc appeared. She was a simple country girl in every way except one. From childhood, Joan heard the voices of angels, who often told her about the future of France and the role that was destined for the girl herself. And so, when she reached her 16th birthday in 1429, Joan went to the nearest city of Vaucouleurs and convinced the captain of the local garrison to help her, predicting the outcome of the still unfinished Battle of Rouvres, near the walls of Orleans. Young Joan of Arc was escorted by a couple of knights and 24 soldiers to reach the royal castle of Chinon, where the eldest son of Charles the Mad, who would later become known as Charles VII the Victorious, was hiding. The voices of the angels that Joan heard called on her to convince the young prince to accept power over France and become the head of the national resistance. And Joan of Arc herself should be placed at the head of the royal army. Rumors about the maid, with whom angels speak, spread faster than lightning throughout France, and the superstitious English sent serious forces to intercept Joan's detachment. But from every ambush, A small army of a couple of knights and 24 soldiers invariably emerged victorious, thanks to the courage and talent of the young girl, who in every battle rushed ahead of everyone and inspired others to victory by personal example. Having reached the royal castle, Joan, not without difficulty, managed to meet with the young prince, who decided to check whether they were telling the truth about Joan of Arc's chosenness. He placed another person on the throne in his place, and he himself stood among the crowd of courtiers. Karl, not without reason, believed that if Joan had never seen him, then without divine help she would not be able to recognize him. However, Joan immediately turned to the real prince, completely ignoring the man on the throne. After this, a conversation took place between them without witnesses, the contents of which still remain a secret. It is not known what exactly Joan said to the future king, but since then he has changed his attitude towards her. Of course, Karl was still tormented by doubts, and he even organized a series of checks to confirm the integrity of the body and spirit of his guest. But soon he himself recognized the calling of Joan and entrusted her with the command of all his remaining troops. The head of these forces, Joan of Arc, set off towards Orleans, which was on the verge of complete defeat. Legends say that near Orleans she wore specially made women's armor. In her hands, Joan clutched the sword of Karl the Great himself, one of the main relics of the French people, and over her head countless banners and banners fluttered. But the British troops were huge, and the French soldiers did not believe in the success of the future operation. Perhaps this is why Joan of Arc began military operations with a small detachment, in order to inspire the rest of the army with several small victories before the main battle. And she succeeded. At Orleans, the invincible English army was defeated in 4 days, and Joan of Arc received the nickname Maid of Orleans in honor of this victory. Her popularity among the common people reached such heights that Karl himself elevated the girl to hereditary nobility. But Joan did not stop there. Soon her army headed towards other French cities under British rule. Under the onslaught of Joan of Arc, all the castles and strongholds of the Loire Valley, the most fortified region of France, fall. The famous English commander Baron Talbot is captured by the French, and another commander, John Fastolfe, flees with the remnants of the English army in front of the advancing Joan of Arc. Many feudal lords, who were afraid to repel the British, or on the contrary, collaborated with them. After that began to go over to the side of Joan. Her army increased day by day. It seemed that France, which had recently been on the verge of its own destruction, had suddenly taken heart, and now nothing could stop it. And ahead of everyone, with flying hair and banners, rushed the invincible Joan. After the capture of Reims, in the local cathedral, in the presence of Joan of Arc, Charles VII officially accepted the title of king and took power over the French people into his own hands. About a year has passed since Joan left her native village. However, events developed as well as possible. No one had any doubt that God had sent young Jeanne to help France, and soon the French began the siege of Paris itself. This is where the first failure occurred. The siege was lost. Joan of Arc was seriously wounded by a crossbow, and the French army was disbanded to avoid destruction. It took Joan of Arc several months to regain her health and return to duty. But the black streak of failures did not seem to stop. In May 1430, Joan went to the city of Compiègne, besieged by an enemy army. However, the townspeople turned out to be traitors, and when Joan of Arc and her forces made their way to the city gates, hoping to take refuge inside and strengthen the forces of the defenders, the bridge to the city was raised and Joan found herself trapped. After a short but fierce battle, Joan of Arc's detachment was killed, and she herself was captured by the Duke of Burgundy, who sold Joan to the English crown for 10,000 gold. It is worth noting that during the time that Joan was held captive and transported from one city to another, the French did not make a single attempt to free their commander. Joan of Arc was kept in the city of Rouen, on the top floor of a castle tower. Pro-English inquisitors and clergy were involved in her trial, who regularly tortured the unfortunate girl, extracting from her confessions of heresy and relations with the devil. However, Joan of Arc stood firm and demonstrated true courage. She denied all charges and demanded a fair trial. The British were afraid to execute Joan without a confession, since in this case she could become a martyr. That's why they decided to deceive her. Standing in front of the fire, on which the British promised to throw Joan, She was asked to sign papers in which she would reject all heresies and recognize the authority of the church. For this, she was promised release. Essentially, the papers contained what Joan followed from the bottom of her heart, so she agreed. But Joan of Arc herself, being a simple village girl, was illiterate and therefore could not read. And so it turned out that the papers were replaced with completely different ones, in which Joan agreed with all the charges brought against her. Naturally, no one was going to free the girl. She was taken back to prison, and a week later a tribunal was held at which Joan of Arc was sentenced to death and burned alive in the center of Rouen. Standing in the middle of a blazing fire, Joan crossed two branches in her hands and shouted the name of Jesus repeatedly until the flames burned out her tongue, eyes, and heart. This happened in 1431. Joan was only 19 years old. However, the death of Joan did not help the British. Quite the contrary. The image of the martyr nevertheless emerged, and many former allies of England and France began to go over to the side of Charles VII. Just 4 years after the execution of Joan of Arc, the French army liberated Paris and all of central France. In 1453, the 100 Years' War finally ended with the defeat of the British, and the French king ordered the organization of an acquittal process in the case of Joan of Arc. Her good name was restored. It is likely that her martyrdom was also part of Joan of Arc's calling. Closer to our time, the Catholic Church elevated Joan of Arc to the ranks of saints, and the French people to this day remember this girl as the greatest national hero in the history of France. Thanks to everyone who watched this video to the end. To find out about the latest releases, you just need to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell. Also, leave your thoughts in the comments and give it a thumbs up. See you soon.